I am an independent consultant, but I'm also involved in Bang. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. Cover some of the topics that have already been covered earlier, but go into some of the aspects of data protection that we need to be thinking about. It's just picking some of those topics, talking a little bit about monitoring, picking up again what people have said earlier today, and TalkTalk is probably our favourite example at the moment. So introduction to me, I used to head up business continuity for Nortel. So before I get into talking about data protection, last year one of the speakers, I don't know who, confidently stated that Nortel had gone out of business due to a hacker, which was news to me as head of business continuity. That was a complete surprise. The reason it went out of business is really much more boring and mundane. It was greed, essentially. A long-standing financial restatement over many, many years due to senior execs misreporting profits to get higher bonuses that had led then into a decline in the company. At the same time, they weren't funding the pensions in the UK and in the US. And so the senior execs at the time decided they would pop into administration or pop into Chapter 11 to ditch the pension funds and pop out again. You might be able to do that with Chapter 11, but you can't do that with the administration law in the UK, and they didn't check. So that ultimately, there were lots of other things going on, and there were undoubtedly hackers within the Nortel networks, internal networks, as there are in virtually every big organisation. But yes, the reason it went out of business is old-fashioned greed and incompetence. But my background is as a techie. I came up as software engineer and architect and moved into business continuity in part from working for a Japanese company. And over in Japan, I noticed how much they built resilience into their day-to-day work environment. So they don't tend to have a business continuity manager. You won't necessarily find one in a Japanese company. It's built into how they do business, and that kind of caught my attention, including I worked for NEC, how they'd built their headquarters, which was a fabulous building, a huge great tower, so that it was earthquake resistant. So it was built on rollers so that it would move with earthquakes in Tokyo rather than come down. So that kind of got me interested, and I gradually moved across from architecting high availability systems into looking at more disaster recovery and business continuity. And as a software engineer and architect, and I've been doing that for rather longer than I'm going to declare up here, but security was always part of what we did for datacoms and telecoms. That has been part of how we've done our business for a long, long time. So back to the other part, which is BANG, Business and National Government. I think the name came after the acronym. It's an informal business continuity network group, organisational resilience, but there's a wide variety of speakers. So it was set up by Steve Yates, who's also an independent business continuity consultant, and he set this up quite a while ago. It's been building up, and just recently the concept's been expanded out to a number of other major cities. So we've already got regional groups within the UK, but also a number of cities, and I think Sydney's one of the more recent ones. Very informal, very supportive, so you can come along there. If you're grappling with a problem and you're not sure how to implement it, you will find plenty of experienced colleagues there who will help talk through and help you work out the best way of going forward. So it is a very, very supportive group. We meet in London in the last Wednesday. If you're in any of the regions, there may well be a regional group closer to you. So you do have a look at that and look at other organisations as well. So my time is really to talk on data protection, and I see my slot has also been cut down in time a little. So the data protection, and you know about the general data protection regulation that's coming along. It's worth going back to basics and thinking about what is it actually trying to do, and it is protecting people from misuse of their data. So keep that in mind as you're implementing it. That is your objective. You're protecting people from misuse of their personal data. And it's to ease the transfer of data around Europe. So it is to ease working across country borders within Europe. It applies across the single market. I haven't put the slide up here, but I've got a slide showing it's an EU directive that also applies to European Economic Area countries as well, and it applies to Switzerland, who's part of the single market. It will apply to us after Brexit. It makes no sense for it not to. We'll need it to be able to continue to do trade. It brings in new obligations, as you've heard, a lot more about data subject consent. I hope that works better than the consent to cookies we have now on websites, because we all just click it without reading what it actually says. We're going to have to hope this is going to work better. Data anonymization, breach notification, I'll talk about that a little later. Transborder data transfers and appointment of data protection officers. And there's some new techniques coming in, and for someone who is a little dyslexic, some of these cause me a little bit of a problem. So pseudonymization, I am assured, is the correct pronunciation, but if it isn't, tell me after, not now. Anonymization, encryption, and data protection by design and by default. So those ideas aren't really new. None of those are new ideas, but they do come into the data protection. So I'm going back to basics a wee bit here, and those are the current principles. And I don't know how many people look back at those and think about what they really mean. I do a certain amount of training on this, and so I try and bring in examples to talk about where they've been misused and what they actually mean, because a lot of them would seem to overlap somewhat. So if you look at the second one, that personal information must be processed for limited purposes, if you actually think about that, you can see that in the last few years, charities have just ignored that wholesale. The charities that sold on information on donors, people who are likely to donate a great deal, people who are a bit more vulnerable to persuasion by cold callers, that information was provided to the original charity for donation purposes, not to be a money spinner for those charities to sell on to other people who could also harass that same person. I know that, we know that personally. My mother is registered blind, and one of my brothers gave her information to the RNIB so that they could provide support to her. They didn't ever provide support, but they did ring her up and ask for money. And she would actually sit there and think, well, I've got the support of my family around me. There's a lot of people who would find it much harder to cope, and she would give them money. And we didn't realise this was happening for a while. They blatantly used that information not for the purpose for which it was given. So think about how that data is being used, and you can see how people are getting it wrong. I've got masses of examples for all of these. One I noticed quite recently on the personal information must be kept accurate and up to date. And there's been a very recent case that I noticed in the press of a young man applying to the army. He'd gone through all the levels of recruitment and was just waiting for his medical report, instead of which he did get the notification from the army on why he was being turned down, and it was due to his being on the heroin addiction, on the methadone program. His GP had mixed up his records with someone else and provided a great deal of information about his apparent drug addiction that had gone back many years. It had to have been very young when he started, based on the information given. It was clearly the wrong person, but they had provided information that was not accurate, and the consequence of it was that he lost a career he wanted to do. So these can have very serious consequences. So as you're looking at data protection, come back and remind yourself what you're doing and why. And that brings me on to the why provide guidelines. So it has legal and reputational implications if you have a data breach. The legal risks are substantially reduced if there's evidence you tried to do the wrong thing. Now, I come from a technology and process background, so I'll leave it to the legal experts to explain exactly how that would work and how much it would be reduced by. Having seen the fine for TalkTalk, I'm not sure it could be reduced any further, and they didn't try and do the right thing, but I will come back to that one. And data protection is one of those with that combination of data protection legislation and cybersecurity technology is a very odd mix, and that makes it very difficult for people to understand. So that comes into, and one of your most important areas is your employee data protection training. Insider threats, insider breaches are massive. A lot of companies like the online governance training, and I'm sure we've all sat through a package that you've got maybe 50 minutes, an hour to go through, and you have to get 8 out of 10 questions correct to pass. And I know why companies do those, so that they can tick it off to say provide the evidence they've provided the training. I would suggest that's not the best way to do data protection training. You need to be able to relate it to people, to give them real examples of how it relates to what they're doing and to their industry and the countries in which they are working, because it varies across Europe. So for HR and medical records and financial records, you'd think that is really obviously personal data. I just finished this presentation and sent it off and went to go and get some lunch, and there was a really long queue for lunch, and I was behind a young builder, and he said, we're all working on the shop, and so we had quite a while. He was asking me what I did for a living. It was a really long queue. So I talked a bit about data protection, and that I'd just finished a presentation on it, and he said, I'd just been asking about my salary information where he works, and the guy that was providing it gave him a list of everybody's. He'd used a marker pen to cross off the salaries, but he could see all the national insurance numbers, and he said when you held it up to the light, he could see everybody's salary. So to him, there was a really solid example. He said the guy had made a few other similar mistakes, and they did sack him. So the building company actually did sack that finance person for providing that type of information and not protecting it. So I was really heartened that they were taking it seriously, disheartened that he clearly didn't understand what he was supposed to do with that data and how he was supposed to protect it. So better training would have helped. And focus on real-life examples. The post office, I know last year, I think it was here, but some of you may have read or heard Bennett Aaron talk about identity theft. Really interesting. Read his book if you haven't already. The post office, because the original identity threat was due to a misdirect, a piece of post that should have been redirected that slipped through. The post office have used him as an example to train their internal staff so they understand how serious it is. If I got an orange flag and I'm hardly through, so we'll shift on to encryption, because that potentially significantly reduces the breach impact. It potentially takes away the need to report, although I find that kind of interesting. But what do you encrypt? A lot of people think it's just the laptops and they're done. They really aren't. If you think about just data at rest, you've got all your other mobile devices. You've got your databases. Now, your database is not a disk, it's a data center. If it's in the cloud, it's someone else's computers and you don't know where they are. And you need to think about your recovery and backup systems as well. But you've also got to encrypt your data that's in transit and know where that data is going, what protocols and applications are actually encapsulating that data, what's that doing with it, is it encrypted, is it encryptable? Are your network devices storing any of that data or just pushing it through? What are your gateway devices doing? And there's a whole load of other questions we can ask. So encryption is not as simple as encrypting your laptops, and too many people think it is. And then your data's going out to your suppliers, your partners, your customers. What are they doing with that data, and are they encrypting it? So one of the other techniques there was pseudonymization and anonymization. So the first is where the identifying data is replaced by encrypted data, which is the pseudonym. It always calculates the same one, so they always look the same, which is the person in the mask, so whoever they are. Anonymization removes that identifying data. It is important it's done properly. I've put an example there of where it wasn't. Employee surveys I would never respond to, because by the time I put in female engineer, that pretty much uniquely identified me most places. Privacy by design. So there's some very good information, came out of Canada originally. It's a big topic in itself, so I won't go into that one. I will look at the monitoring, just to say, other speakers have said this morning about pulling together those tools, use things like dark trace, where it'll learn normal and spot deviations, spot your outliers, detect your intruders. You have to combine it all, because usually there's masses of data and it's just not been used. So incident response. It is essential that you have exercised that team and that you have everybody involved. You have legal there, you have HR, you have communications. You've got to have everybody there, as well as your technical people and your CEO. Take them through exercises so they understand other people's skill sets. They understand what information and what it means, and your technical people understand the level of knowledge they've got. Really, it's so different. You really will get huge amounts of benefit of doing exercises. I think I'm about out of time, so talk. You can read the slides. It's really depressing that 18 years after SQL injection was out there, they're still falling for it.